Hi, welcome back to Father and Son Investing. Today's video will be for I-bond investors. If you are not aware, there is a very important change that is about to take place in the way that the consumer price index is weighted. I'm talking about WEIGHT weight. What we're talking about here is the piece of the pie and how big of a slice each part of that consumer price index will occupy. Today we're going to talk about when that change will take place. We'll talk about what that change is. We will talk about the effect that that will have upon inflation and thus the effect that it will have upon I-bond holders and purchasers. And lastly, we'll talk about what I think is the most important thing that you should be watching for in terms of your I-bond. All of that, hopefully, in less than 10 minutes. All right, first item of business, let's just talk about the announcement for the 2023 CPI weight information. It has kind of flown under the radar, but when the data comes out next week, that's the answer to question number 2, February 14th, that's when the new weighting system will be used. When this data comes out on February 14th, it is going to significantly affect the way that inflation is calculated. Let's talk about that. For about the past 20 years, the weighting system has been calculated based on biennial data, meaning 2 years of data. So for instance, here's an example from the BLS website. Data that was surveyed in 2019 and 2020 would then be analyzed during 2021 and utilized during 2022 and 23. So you would see yourself using data that was on average about 36 months old. The new weighting system is going to change that. It will become an annual weight update. So, for instance, now, the data from 2021 would be collected, it would be analyzed in 2022, and then it would be used for 2023 weighting purposes. That means that starting next month, when this data gets released for the month of January, the weight of that data will be based upon the results that they collected in surveys from 2021. That will change the average data to 24 months old instead of 36 months old, making it more recent by essentially 1/3. Now I'm going to change the order of the questions that I posed at the beginning because I posed them as how will this affect I-bond holders and what should we be watching for. I'm going to reverse that in answering those, and we're going to talk about what we should be watching for, at least what I think we should be watching for in this data based upon the new way that they're going to weight it. So let's just take as an example this pie chart here from May of 2022 for the consumer price index. This changes from month to month, but this illustrates the point. You'll see that the biggest part of this pie here is in green. This is the owner equivalent rent. We'll talk about that, and then rent and lodging and shelter related. But obviously this is going to make up the biggest part, and actually this does every month. Now stay with me here because I'm going to lead you through this. I know this can get a little technical, but hang in there. Since shelter makes up the largest piece of the pie, it is important to understand how the shelter part of this index gets calculated because it's different than the other goods and services that you'll see in the consumer price index. Think of the way that BLS collects this data as having 6 baskets, and each of those baskets are going to get sampled every 6 months. That means that you'll have data for basket number 1 in January and July, and so on, February and August, etc. Now that is a distinct difference than the price of eggs getting calculated every month. So if we look at that, there's going to be a significant lag in the data, both on upswings of prices and on downswings of prices. This graph shows a nice example of that coming from the Brookings Institute. If they're taking real-time data, which you can get from Zillow observed rent or near real-time data anyway, and we're looking at that compared to the CPI rent, we'll see that the rent was significantly lagging behind the real-time prices during 2021. In similar fashion, I'm going to borrow this slide from Jerome Powell's speech back in 2022, November 2022, where he shows how the now steep declines in housing or shelter are lagging that of the inflation data. Now in this case, the Fed likes to use PCE, which stands for Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. It is different than CPI, especially in terms of the weight that they give to housing, but it illustrates the point of this lag that's taking place. So we can see here these various colors of graphs here. We've got an apartment list, we've got real page, which is just another way of calculating what's happening real time. We've got the Zillow in this thin blue line. And we've got core logic in this sort of aquamarine line here. Now, we'll see that all of those have started to plunge during 2022, but all of these are significantly down. Meanwhile, we'll see this red line here is continuing to rise. So while real-time prices are coming down, the inflation data is saying that the housing prices or shelter piece of the pie is still going up. And here's just one more great example of this lag. You'll see here the Case-Shiller index. Again, another way of kind of looking at housing real time versus the CPI shelter index. And you can see that they mirror each other pretty well, but there's a nice lag here. Here's the Case-Shiller index going up when the inflation data said it was going down, and vice versa. And we'll see that this Case-Shiller index is now on its way down. And here's where you can see that if you go to the St. Louis Fed, you will see that it's on the way down here, okay? So what we gather out of this is the shelter costs are actually coming down while the inflation data has been saying that it's going up. Now, why does that matter if you are an I-bond investor? If you are an I-bond holder or thinking about purchasing more I-bonds, you need to think about this housing problem here. As the largest piece of the pie, if there is a change in the housing or shelter index, that will disproportionately affect the consumer price index. What am I talking about when I say disproportionately? I mean that, say for instance, there's a 5% decrease in the shelter index. That will be much greater or have a much greater effect than if there is a 5% decrease in food and the price of eggs, although maybe just barely with the price of eggs as high as those prices have been. The point that I've made for I-bond investors is that number one, they should expect that the shelter index will be coming down. The amount of money that people are spending month to month on shelter will be decreasing. It already is happening real time, and we're going to start to see that in the data soon. Remember, I discussed that there is that 6-month lag because they take prices in January and July and compare them. So there's always this 6-month aggregate going on within the housing or shelter index. I personally think that that data is going to start showing up in the March and April data. Now, I-bond investors, of course, they know that the cutoff date for the CPI calculation in terms of what your variable rate will be on your I-bond is in March and in September. Now, when this decline in the shelter index shows up, remember it's going to have a disproportionate effect because it occupies such a big piece of the pie right now. The reason I think it's important to keep this housing piece of the pie in mind is I know there's folks out there who are talking about that core CPI is still going up. Remember, core CPI is essentially inflation minus energy and food because those can be so volatile month to month. So this is the last little piece of data I'm going to torture you with. Let's just take a look. Core CPI then would be all items less food and energy. So we're looking at this line right here, and we'll see that despite the fact that inflation had been going down for the past few months, the core CPI has still been going up and ended at the month of December at 5.7% on an annual basis. So some people may be arguing, since core inflation is going up, that they would expect that their I-bond variable rate will go up, or at least not get hit quite so hard when the new rate comes out in May of 2023. But just keep in mind that this housing decrease that I'm expecting to come in the next few months, at least in the data, again, it's already happening real time, will likely offset any of these core CPI increases because it occupies such a big piece of the pie and will disproportionately affect the consumer price index, as I mentioned. Hopefully that was good enough for you. If you have other questions, please feel free to leave them for me. I know that this is getting down into the weeds a little bit, but the take-home point is don't expect your I-bond rate to go very high, the variable rate, come May 1st. At least I don't. The good news in there might be that we could expect that the fixed rate might go up, but that is a discussion for another day. Please share this kind of information with a young person in your life. It may get a little more than they want to talk about, but at least share with them some of the basics, and that will help make sure that you understand the basics here as well. Until next time, enjoy your investing.